Imagine you're standing outside on a normal afternoon. Cars are moving. People are talking. Birds are flying overhead. Everything seems completely normal. Then suddenly, the oxygen disappears. Not for an hour. Not for a minute. Just 5 seconds. It sounds harmless, right? 5 seconds isn't enough time to hold your breath and panic. But here's the terrifying part. If Earth suddenly lost all of its oxygen for just 5 seconds, the world around you could change in ways you would never expect. Welcome back to Future and Facts Hub. Today, we're exploring one of the most terrifying questions imaginable. What if Earth lost oxygen for 5 seconds? Let's start with the first thing you would notice. Nothing. For a tiny fraction of a second, you probably wouldn't even realize anything had happened. Your brain would still be functioning because your blood would still contain some oxygen. You wouldn't instantly collapse. But the environment around you would be a completely different story. Every combustion engine would immediately have a problem. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, airplanes, and many industrial machines depend on oxygen to burn fuel. Remove oxygen from the atmosphere, and combustion suddenly stops. Imagine millions of vehicles across the United States moving down highways. Then, for 5 seconds, everything stops burning. A gasoline engine can't continue combustion without oxygen. A jet engine can't keep burning fuel without oxygen. Fires would instantly go out. A candle in your home? Gone. A fireplace? Gone. A forest fire? Gone. Even a massive industrial fire would suddenly disappear. And that sounds like good news. But oxygen isn't only important for fire. It's also part of the atmosphere itself. Earth's atmosphere is roughly 21% oxygen. Removing all of it for 5 seconds would cause atmospheric pressure to drop dramatically. And that creates another problem. Your ears would feel it. Your body would experience a sudden change in pressure. Although the exact effects would depend on how quickly the oxygen vanished and returned. But here's where things get really strange. The sky would change. The blue color of Earth's sky exists because molecules in the atmosphere scatter sunlight, with shorter blue wavelengths being scattered more strongly. Remove a huge portion of the atmosphere's oxygen molecules, and the appearance of the sky would change. It wouldn't necessarily turn completely black like outer space, because nitrogen and other gases would still remain. But the sky could appear noticeably darker. For 5 seconds, the familiar blue sky could become something very different. And then there's something almost nobody thinks about. Concrete. Concrete contains oxygen as part of its chemical structure. So do countless minerals and materials around us. But losing atmospheric oxygen does not mean every oxygen atom on Earth magically disappears. We're talking specifically about the oxygen gas in the atmosphere. That distinction matters. The oxygen inside water molecules wouldn't suddenly vanish. The oxygen inside your body wouldn't disappear. The oxygen chemically bound inside rocks and materials wouldn't simply evaporate. Only atmospheric oxygen would be removed. And that means you wouldn't instantly lose every oxygen atom in existence. But your lungs would still face a serious problem. During those 5 seconds, the air entering your lungs would contain essentially no oxygen. You would inhale, but there would be nothing useful for your blood to absorb. Fortunately, 5 seconds is extremely short. Your body has oxygen reserves in your blood and tissues. So a healthy person wouldn't instantly suffocate. You might feel a sudden inability to breathe normally. But the biggest immediate danger would actually come from the environment. Think about airplanes. At cruising altitude, aircraft already operate in an environment where oxygen levels and pressure are much lower than at sea level. Modern airplanes use pressurized cabins and carefully controlled systems. If atmospheric oxygen suddenly disappeared, aircraft engines would lose the oxygen required for combustion. The engines would stop producing thrust. That could create a catastrophic situation for aircraft that were in flight. But remember, we're talking about only 5 seconds. If oxygen returned after those 5 seconds, engines that were designed to restart could potentially recover. However, not every aircraft or system would respond perfectly. The exact consequences would depend on the altitude, aircraft design, engine condition, and how quickly oxygen disappeared and returned. Now let's come back to the ground. What about humans? Would everyone pass out? Probably not. 5 seconds is simply too short for most healthy people to become unconscious solely because of oxygen deprivation. Your brain doesn't instantly run out of oxygen the moment you stop breathing. You already have oxygen dissolved in your blood and stored in your body's tissues. So if you're standing in your backyard when this happens, you might survive the 5 seconds without serious injury. But there would be another danger. Panic. Imagine millions of people suddenly noticing that fires have gone out. Cars are behaving strangely. Aircraft are experiencing engine problems. The sky looks different. And nobody knows why. For 5 seconds, the entire planet would experience one of the strangest environmental events in human history. Then, oxygen comes back. Suddenly, the atmosphere returns to normal. Fires that were extinguished wouldn't automatically restart. A candle wouldn't magically reignite. A gasoline engine that stopped wouldn't necessarily restart by itself. And that's an important detail. Losing oxygen for 5 seconds would stop combustion. Restoring oxygen doesn't automatically recreate the flame or restart every engine. You would have to reignite many fires manually. But there is another enormous question. What happens to the ozone layer? Ozone is made from oxygen atoms. The ozone layer protects Earth from much of the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. But a 5-second disappearance of atmospheric oxygen would not instantly destroy the ozone layer. Chemical reactions in the atmosphere take time. And ozone is a separate molecule from ordinary oxygen gas. So the planet wouldn't suddenly become a radiation-filled wasteland 5 seconds later. The real damage would depend heavily on the exact physical mechanism causing the oxygen to disappear. And that's where this thought experiment becomes even more interesting. Because if oxygen could somehow disappear instantly and then return instantly, the event might be terrifying but relatively short-lived. But if the disappearance happened through some physical process that also affected atmospheric pressure, temperature, chemistry, or other gases, the consequences could become much worse. That's why the question isn't simply about breathing. It's about the entire atmosphere. Oxygen is involved in combustion, respiration, atmospheric chemistry, and countless natural processes. Remove it, even briefly, and you interrupt systems that normally operate every second of every day. And there's one more thing you might notice when oxygen returns. Your surroundings would suddenly feel normal again. You'd breathe. Cars would eventually restart. People would look around in confusion. The sky would return to its familiar appearance. And 5 seconds would be over. 5 seconds. That's less time than it takes to blink twice. Yet during those 5 seconds, the planet could experience a chain reaction unlike anything humanity has ever witnessed. So would humanity survive? Most people on the ground would probably survive the 5-second oxygen loss itself. The biggest dangers would come from secondary effects, aircraft problems, sudden atmospheric changes, interrupted combustion, industrial accidents, and widespread confusion. The event wouldn't necessarily destroy civilization, but it could create one of the most chaotic 5 seconds in human history. And here's the truly mind-blowing part. We often think of oxygen as something simple, something we breathe. But oxygen is much more than that. It's one of the fundamental ingredients that makes modern life possible. Every breath you take depends on it. Every natural ecosystem depends on it. And much of the technology around you indirectly depends on it too. Take oxygen away for 5 seconds. And suddenly, you realize just how fragile the world around us really is. So the next time you take a breath, remember this. You don't notice oxygen because it's always there. But if it disappeared, even for just 5 seconds, the entire planet would notice. This is Future and Facts Hub. If you enjoyed this thought experiment, subscribe to the channel because next time, we're going even further into the impossible. What if Earth suddenly stopped spinning? You definitely don't want to miss that one.